Hi, my name's Amanda and I'm here in my Sparkle Corner to talk about another trauma-triggered memory, I suppose, from that's been brought up along this process of becoming, or the realisation of being suddenly autistic at the age of 46. You see, I always forget how old I am, which is kind of weird, because it doesn't really bother me, but it's kind of just a weird thing. Anyway, this traumatic memory is related to the birth of my first child. And the traumatic memory, I suppose there's all sorts of trauma that can come with giving birth, and it's around the early hours of her birth, so straight afterwards. So getting my baby out into the world was quite painful. There was several things that during that labour process that I felt stretched me. I thought at one point I was going to die, and I was like, well, as long as I get the baby out, that's fine. Go back to my logical processing and just dig deep and deal with it. And that's exactly what I did. So I remember having pethidine, and the pethidine didn't work for me. It made me feel no different. And now I know that my brain works in peculiar ways, or differently to most people. It makes sense that a drug like pethidine, that's usually meant to relax or whatever it's supposed to do other people, it didn't work that way for me. For me, it did nothing. Then I had an epidural, and that kind of numbed one side but not both sides. That could just be one of those things. Then ended up with a volunteers delivery. Long story short, she eventually came out, but my body was wrecked, or it felt wrecked. Anyway, after a lot of social interaction, bright lights, lots of people, lots of noise, lots of in your face, I was then the complete contrast happened. And I was wheeled up to the ward, and by this time it was getting on in the evening. It was probably about 8:30, 9 o'clock. It was definitely late enough to be dark, and people were going to bed. I wasn't offered any food at that point. I did remember that, because I thought, well, at what point I didn't know what to do, and I was left for the first time with this little baby, who I was delighted to have, was ecstatic about, and fell in love with immediately. But my baby stared at me all night long. Literally stared at me, and she could have only been an hour or two old, probably 2 hours old maximum by the time we went to the ward. And I was left with this thing in my arms that I knew I loved and I felt connected to, but she was staring at me in a way that I didn't feel comfortable with. But it was weird. It was just weird, because I don't even know the right words to say about it, but it wasn't right for me. That interaction wasn't right for me. And I didn't know what she was searching for. I just didn't know. Clearly it made an impression on me, because it's still making me lose my words, which is what I'm doing now, because I don't know how to explain it, and I don't want to minimize it or have people think the wrong thing. I loved this baby, and I was pleased to have her, and I was paying her attention. I was trying to feed her. I was loving her as best as I could, but I was also in a sense of complete overwhelm and trauma, having just endured a physical sensation in my body that was beyond my comprehension and was completely overwhelming, not least processing the thought that I'd legitimately thought I was about to die, whether that was relevant or not, or accurate. To the moment. Sorry, I should have said accurate, not relevant. But anyway, there was a lot going on for me, but I realised that now I'm a mother, I am, the child comes first. But that's what I've been reflecting on, really. And now, I will say something else. That moment of clearly passed, and when it was light in the ward, I felt a little bit more comfortable, and I started to to function a little bit and do things, I suppose, and I cared for and looked after my baby in a normal way. But the eye contact thing was clearly something that my daughter had an instinct for and knew was important to her, but that I was challenged by, but hadn't got the capacity to understand at that point, and only really noticed the significance of that recently, like as in yesterday, or even last night it might have been. Now, in her early years, we decided as a family that my husband would be the primary carer or take on the mothering, and I would take on the fathering role. This is talking gender stereotypes, and I'd go back to work. So that's what happened. In the early days when I was still on maternity leave, so you're talking up to 12 weeks, and I was breastfeeding her, and I continued to breastfeed her while I was at work and express bottles for my husband. During those early days, I noticed very early on that my daughter was more colicky and agitated with me than she was with my husband. Now, I remember clearly acknowledging those signs, making notes of all that kind of stuff, mentally mostly rather than physically, and then being delighted with the joy that my daughter and the ease that my daughter seemed to feel with my husband. It seemed natural for me that we put the baby with the person with whom they are most comfortable and who has that instinctual connection. And again, I didn't think any more of it. I didn't attach any shame to that. I didn't feel guilty for that. I didn't feel any less of a female or woman or mother. Even though I was using and referring to my husband as the mother, that was more of an irony in terms of society's expectations around men and women. Because for me, I understand now the role of mothering in a completely different, non-gendered way. But for me, I would say he's taking on the mother role and I'm taking on the father role, because at that point I thought society was stupid and we'd already received some judgments about our family orientation, I guess, as you might call it. So I was comfortable in my skin knowing I was doing the right thing for my daughter, whom I loved very much, and I realised that I was this source of distress for her. Before she could talk, process or display any other dysregulation, I suppose, from how I was interacting with her and not meeting her needs perfectly, she was showing us through her body language and her discomfort. And of course, I didn't read it with the insight I've got now. I read it with, oh, there's a problem, here's a solution. Look at how naturally he does it. And I wanted to share that with you because I'm grateful every day that I'm learning more and more about myself and learning how all the parts of me are coming together, and that have, some of the things about me, like, for example, my neurodiversity, and even some of the trauma of being a neurodiverse person who has that invisible difference and who it's invisible to themselves. How I've learnt resilience and been naturally orientated to focus on challenging the social narrative and challenging it with truth. Look at this. Does it matter what people think? This is the right thing to do. Why are you saying that and doing that? That's been my natural orientation. So I'm forever grateful that I am who I am, and that I persisted and have got to this point in spite of it all, and that I wasn't scared or ashamed of the decisions that I made that were best for me in those times, but also best in the context of my relationships. I didn't have to put aside my version of my reality or my fantasy of who I thought I might be as a mother in order to give my daughter the best outcome for me, the best outcome I could manage. Now, reflecting on that initial lack of eye contact, or that initial response to the eye contact, I did recognize that I needed to look at her, and I did look at her. It wasn't that I didn't, I absolutely do, and I can make eye contact with people. But I recognize now that non-instinctual response from the primary caregiver at that moment would cause a baby distress, and probably did cause distress. My baby may have looked at me longer than the average newborn, freshly born baby. Maybe she was looking for something that she couldn't see, and that was then causing distress and, oh my God, what do I do now? Maybe I'm projecting and overthinking that. That's not my journey, and that's my daughter's to unpack and to integrate into her life and to re-examine if and when she wants to. But from my perspective, that was a time when my autistic vulnerability was potentially very visible. Potentially my newborn daughter of a couple of hours old recognized my neurodiversity and my autism before anybody else. So maybe she gave me this gift of knowing myself. Maybe that's what life's all about.